As the four friends gathered at the edge of Blackwood Forest, the earthy smell of damp leaves hung in the air. It was a gray, overcast day, the kind where the sky seemed to be pressing down on the world below. They didn't want to come here, not really, but they had no choice. Their friend Ethan had disappeared 3 days ago, and this was the last place he had been seen. "We don't have to do this," Mia muttered, clutching the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her dark hair was pulled back, but strands of it clung to her sweat-dampened forehead. She was the one who found Ethan's phone, broken and abandoned on the forest path, with a single cryptic message flickering on the screen. "It's watching." "It's too late to back out," Jace snapped, his voice sharp but unsteady. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a bravado that seemed forced under the weight of the tall pines. He adjusted the baseball bat slung over his shoulder as if it could protect them from whatever had taken Ethan. Lila stepped forward, quietly, her boots crunching on the gravel path. She held up a crumpled map Ethan had drawn a few weeks ago when he was obsessed with exploring an abandoned forest ranger station. "He said there's something here," she whispered, her breath misty with cold. "Something old. Something wrong." The fourth, Owen, said nothing. He just stared into the trees, his pale face unreadable, his hands deep in his jacket pockets. He was Ethan's closest friend, the one who had tried to talk him out of going out at night. Now the guilt gnawed at him like a living thing. They moved forward as one, the forest swallowing them whole. The trail twisted and narrowed until the branches caught on their clothes. Every crunch of a branch, every rustle of leaves made their hearts beat faster. Mia kept looking back over her shoulder, convinced she saw something, a shadow darting between the trees, but when she pointed at it, there was nothing there. An hour later, they came to a clearing. Ahead of them stood the ranger station, its windows gaping like empty eye sockets and its door hanging ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. Jace took a step toward them, but froze when Owen grabbed his arm. "Listen," Owen hissed. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing, just a heavy, suffocating silence. Then, barely audible from inside the station, there was a sound, a low, wet gurgle, as if something was choking on its own blood. The beam of Mia's flashlight jerked toward the door, illuminating a red stain on the threshold. Fresh. Shiny. "Oh, my God," Lila gasped, stepping back. This can't be." Before she could finish, the gurgling stopped. The silence returned, thicker now, pressing against her eardrums. Jace picked up the bat, his bravado crumbling. "Let's check it out," he said, but his voice broke. They didn't move. Not yet. Because in that moment, they all felt it, the unshakable certainty that what was inside was no longer Ethan. And worse, it knew they were there. The air grew colder as the two friends froze at the edge of the clearing, the ranger station looming like a predator biding its time. The smear of blood on the doorstep glistened under the shivering beam of Mia's flashlight, and the silence pulsed with a weight that made my skin crawl. Jace took a shaky step forward, raising his bat, his breath coming out in rapid clouds. "We can't just stand here," he said, though his eyes betrayed his terror. Mia shook her head. "Absolutely not. It's blood, Jace. Fresh blood. We need to call the police." "What signal?" Owen snapped, his voice low and bitter. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and held it up, at the 0 mark. "We're on our own." Lila clutched Ethan's map tighter, her fingers smudging the ink. "He would have wanted us to find him," she said, but her words sounded hollow, more pleading than conviction. Reluctantly, they trudged into the station, the creaking of the floorboards under their boots echoing in the silence like gunshots. Inside, the air was sour, thick with mold and something metallic, blood, perhaps, or worse. The walls were speckled with dirt, and old papers lay on the floor, yellowed and curled. Mia's light slid across a rusty table, a broken chair, and then something that made her gasp. In the corner, half hidden by shadows, was a pile of clothes. Ethan's clothes. His green jacket, torn and stained with dark wet spots, lay crumpled next to his shoes, one of which was still laced up, as if it had been pulled off his foot. "Oh, no, 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 no," Mia whimpered, stumbling backward into Jace. He caught her, but his own face was ashen. Owen knelt beside the pile, his hands shaking as he reached for his jacket. Before he could touch it, the floor beneath him groaned a deep, unnatural sound, as if the building itself were alive. Then, with a crash, the boards gave way beneath his feet. Owen screamed, falling into the darkness, disappearing into a jagged hole that hadn't been there a moment before. "Owen!" Lila screamed as she lunged forward, but Jace yanked her back just as the edges of the hole closed like a mouth and they would snap together with a sickening crunch. The floor was solid again, without any marks, as if nothing had happened. What the hell was that? Jace screamed, his back clattering to the ground. He whirled wildly, his eyes darting to the walls, the ceiling, the door, anywhere the threat might come from in the next moment. Mia was sobbing, her flashlight shaking so hard that the beam danced across the room. This isn't real. This can't be real. Lila pressed herself against the wall, her breath catching. We need to get out of here. Now. But as they turned to run, the door, the only way out, slammed so hard it shook the bones of the station. A sound came from behind them, a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging on wood. And then a voice. Not Owen's, not Ethan's, but something guttural, wet, and incredibly deep. Stay. The friends froze, their blood turning to ice. The walls seemed to pulsate, the shadows stretched and twisted into shapes that shouldn't have existed. Whatever had taken Ethan wasn't done with them yet. The ranger station seemed smaller, the walls closing in, and the friends stood paralyzed, the echo of that guttural halt reverberating in their skulls. The door, now closed, shuddered as the scraping grew louder, slow, methodical, as if something outside was savoring their fear. Mia's sobs subsided to ragged gasps, her flashlight flickering as its battery began to die. Jace grabbed for the bat again, though it seemed useless against the invisible force pressing down on them. We can't just stand here, Lila whispered, her voice barely audible over the scraping. She felt for Ethan's map, her hands shaking as she traced the faded lines. There's a back room. Maybe a window. Before she could finish, the lights went out, not only Mia's flashlight, but also the faint gray glow that came through the broken windows. The darkness swallowed them whole, thick and impenetrable, as if the forest itself had penetrated them. A low, wet laugh slipped through the air, as if from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Give me your hand, Jace shouted, searching blindly for Mia. She grabbed it, digging her nails into his arm, and Lila clung to his jacket. They staggered to where the back room was supposed to be, guided only by memory and the sporadic protest of the floor beneath them. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but their panicked breathing and the pounding of their hearts. Then a sound came from the corner they had left behind, fabric tearing, slowly and deliberately. Mia groaned as she realized it was Ethan's jacket, tearing to pieces in the darkness. They came to a wall, and Lila felt around with her hands until she found the doorknob, cold and slippery from something wet. She turned it, and the door groaned open, letting them into a narrow room. The darkness was lighter here, tinged with a sickly green glow from the cracked skylight overhead. The air stank of rot, and the floor was littered with shards of old tin cans, broken glass, and something sticky that had stuck to their shoes. Look, Jace hissed, pointing. There was a window against the far wall, boarded up, but with gaps wide enough to squeeze through. Hope flickered briefly until they heard it. A soft knock, then another. Footsteps. Heavy, uneven, dragging something behind them. The sound came from the main room, getting closer. Mia turned around, her dying flashlight catching a glimpse of the doorway they had just passed through. For a split second, she saw him, a silhouette, tall and twisted, limbs too long, head tilted at an impossible angle. One hand was dangling, pulling something shiny, a piece of Ethan's phone, with the eerie message still flickering. It's watching. She screamed, and the figure disappeared as its light spilled outward. Jace rushed to the window, slamming his bat against the boards. They shattered, but not enough. Now footsteps could be heard in the room, slow and unhurried, the debris creaking across the floor like nails on a chalkboard. Lila grabbed a rusty pipe from the rubble and joined Jace in pounding on the boards until one gave way. The cold air rushed in, but so did something else, a low, piercing howl from outside that grew into a chorus of screams that made my ears burn. The forest was not empty. It was alive, and it was angry. The creature behind them growled, closer now, its breath wet and hot on their necks. They had seconds, maybe less. The window shattered as the creature in the room rushed at him. Jace felt a rush of air, rancid and heavy, as if something was brushing his shoulders with claws, perhaps, or fingers too long and cold to be human. He did not look back. He pushed Mia through the gap first. Her scream cut off as she fell into the night. Lila went next, her pipe clattering to the floor as she slipped out, leaving bloody streaks on the uneven wood from her torn hands. Jace rushed after them, the bat slipping from his hands as he hit the ground outside. The forest was now a cacophony of screams, the trees themselves shaking with rage. He jumped to his feet, grabbing Mia and Lila, who were sprawled in the dirt, their faces pale and tear-stained. Run, he shouted, but the word barely got out of his mouth as the station exploded behind them. The walls bent outward, the wood cracked like bones, and a figure emerged from the rubble tall, hunched over, with limbs that twitched as if they were malfunctioning. Its face, if it had one, was a blurred shadow, but its eyes glowed a dull, festering yellow. He moved fast, too fast, leaning toward them, the shard of Ethan's phone still trailing behind him, glistening on the ground. They ran for the trees, branches cutting their faces, roots clinging to their legs. The screams from the forest grew louder, joined by a hideous chorus of whispers, words they didn't understand but felt deep in their guts, promising pain. Mia stumbled, her ankle twisting with a wet crunch, and Jace picked her up, half dragging her along as she sobbed. Lila clutched the map, now crumpled and useless, her breathing sharp, panicked, ragged. "It's coming," she screamed, risking a glance back. The monster was closer, its yellow eyes darting in the darkness, its limbs breaking branches like twigs. And it was not alone. Shadows moved between the trees, smaller, faster, their shapes indistinct but full of malice. One flashed past, close enough for Jace to see its hands. Clumsy, claw-like hands smeared with something dark and wet. They stumbled into the ravine, the ground beneath them giving way abruptly. They slid down, tangled in a tangle of limbs, and landed hard in a shallow stream. The water was icy and stank of rot, its surface slippery with an oily sheen. Mia choked on her ankle, and Jace pulled her to her feet. "We can't stop," he muttered, his voice raw. Lila pointed upstream, where the ravine narrowed to a cavernous mouth, barely visible under a tangle of roots. "There, we can hide." They splashed toward it, the water slowing them down, and the creature's growl sounding overhead. Smaller shadows were now circling, their whispers turning into laughter, high, sharp, and furious. They reached the cave just as the creature climbed the crest of the ravine. It stopped, sniffing the air, tilting its head as if it sensed their fear. The friends squeezed inside, pressing against the damp stone walls. The cave was cramped, the ceiling low, and the air stank of rot. As their eyes adjusted, they realized why. Bones lay on the floor, some animal, some not. Skulls smiled down at them, human and hollow, with pale, wriggling creatures crawling out of their eye sockets. And behind them, leaning against the wall, stood a figure. Ethan, or what was left of him. Mia put her hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Jace's stomach lurched, but he couldn't look away. Lila whispered, "Oh my God," her voice breaking. Something roared outside, and the cave shook. Rocks fell, dust clogged the air. It was coming at them. The cave shuddered as whatever was outside slammed into the entrance, its claws raking in stone with a screech that made my teeth pop. Dust and stones rained down, and writhing creatures and skulls ducked into the shadows as if to escape what was coming. Mia pressed herself against the wall, forgetting about her injured ankle, her eyes fixed on Ethan's corpse. Jace stood in front of her, fists clenched, even though he had nothing to fight with. Lila clutched the map to her chest, muttering something incoherent, perhaps a prayer, or just plain crazy. "We're dead," Mia whispered, her voice steady, resigned. "It will tear us apart like it tore him apart." "Shut up," Jace snapped, but his own voice was shaking. He scanned the cave for something, weapons, a way out, but there was nothing but bones and rot. The back wall was solid, covered in moss and something darker, like long-dried blood. The creature roared again, and this time its cavernous throat cracked, its roots snapping as it pushed in. Its yellow eyes glowed brighter now, illuminating its form in a shimmer. A mass of twisted flesh, limbs bent at the wrong angle, a mouth too wide open, filled with jagged, gleaming teeth. Smaller shadows circled him, their laughter rising to a frenzied pitch, bouncing off the walls until it seemed to come from inside their skulls. Lila screamed and threw the map at them, a desperate, futile gesture. The paper flew to the ground, but upon impact, the creature froze. Its head returned to the map, and for a moment the air was still. The whispering stopped. The smaller shadows stepped back, their outlines flickering like dying flames. "What the hell?" Jace breathed, stepping forward despite himself. The map lay open, the lines Ethan had scratched barely glowing, a network of paths, marks, and a single word circled in red. "Seal." Lila's eyes widened. "He found something," she said, her voice trembling with realization. He tried to stop it. Before they could realize it, the creature lunged, its claws pointed at Jace. He dove to the side, colliding with Mia, and they hit the ground hard. A claw hit the wall, glistening on the stone, and a low rumble shook the cave. The moss-covered back wall rippled and then split with a wet, tearing sound, revealing a tunnel beyond, dark, narrow, and reeking of sulfur. "Let's go," Lila shouted, pulling Mia up. They headed into the tunnel. The creatures roared deafeningly behind them. The claws clawed at Jace's leg as he pushed Mia forward, tearing at his jeans. He screamed, but kept moving. The tunnel twisted downward, the walls shrinking around them, slippery and warm, like living tissue. The creature followed, its mass scraping against the stone, its growls turning into guttural howls of rage. Smaller shadows swarmed past him, their claws digging into the five friends, drawing blood with every step. They burst into the room, the air thick with heat and the stench of decay. In the center was a pit surrounded by crude carving symbols Ethan must have seen, must have understood. The map's seal was scratched into the rim, glowing a subtle red. Down in the darkness, something wriggled, a mass of antennae and eyes older than the forest, older than anything they could comprehend. "It's a trap," Lila realized too late. He didn't stop it. He woke it up. The creature behind them screamed, and the pit pulsed, tentacles reaching upward. One wrapped around Mia's waist, pulling her to the edge. She clawed at the ground, screaming, but it was too strong. Jace grabbed her arm, pulling with all his might, but another tendril latched onto his leg, pulling him down as well. Lila rushed to help, but was grabbed by a third, her screams cut off. The cave monster roared triumphantly as it stepped into the room, the glow of the pit immersing it in a crimson glow. It no longer pursued them, it herded them. Ethan's map was the bait, his obsession was the key, and they walked right into it. The last thing Jace saw as the tendrils dragged them into the hole was Ethan's empty shell sliding down behind them, his skull smiling as if he had known about it all along. The forest swallowed their screams, and Blackwood fell silent again, waiting for his next victim.